Hello and welcome to Constitutionally Sound, a podcast by the Centre on Constitutional Change at the University of Edinburgh. I'm Allan Little, I'm a journalist and broadcaster, and I'll be guiding you through this episode, Governing England. The pandemic has not only exposed tensions between Westminster and the three devolved nations of the United Kingdom, it has also shone an unforgiving light on the way England is governed. As we entered the second wave of COVID-19 and Westminster began to impose localised lockdowns, some of the regions of England rose in angry revolt. Boris Johnson found himself locking horns with political figures that had been hitherto marginal on the national stage, but who now enjoyed a new prominence and public legitimacy, most notably the Labour Mayor of Greater Manchester, Andy Burnham. It raises the question, is the UK state over-centralised and unresponsive to regional variations in public need? Has the pandemic made the case for devolution within England itself? And if so, how? Where is governance in England headed? There's no one better to talk about that over the next half hour or so than Michael Kenny, Professor of Public Policy at the University of Cambridge. He's the foremost authority on the politics and governance of England. He's the inaugural director of the Bennett Institute for Public Policy at Cambridge University. He's also fellow of the Centre on Constitutional Change and the Constitution Unit at UCL. Michael, why has there been until now so little enthusiasm for devolution in England?
In answer to that, you've got to sort of track back to think about there's an inherent ambiguity really about what devolution means in the context of England. Obviously, towards the very end of the last century, devolution was introduced for other parts of the UK, for Northern Ireland, for Scotland, for Wales, and so devolution was developed as an idea that referenced whole territorial areas and indeed nations. But the question of what devolution would mean for England has always really been more ambiguous. Does it mean offering England as a whole some kind of representation or some sort of voice? Or does it mean actually introducing more localised governance in different parts of England? And I think one sort of prelude, I think, to the current crisis is that question has never been answered decisively in British politics. For the most part, British politicians have tended to go with the second of those ideas, have tended to assume that if devolution is going to happen in this case, this is really going to be about giving more powers to different parts of England, not really to England as a whole. But then also, I think something else that's very important here is that there's a very different perspective that's tended to be taken from the centre, from Whitehall and Westminster, when those players look out at the country they govern, that England has always been treated differently. And it's been, I think, quite often assumed really to be the core territory of the state. And that assumption has tended to play to the idea that England as a whole doesn't need to be represented here because it's the dominant player in the state. So the focus has been on, let's think about some sort of decentralisation, but within very constrained limits. And in England, what I think devolution has come to mean is finding a way to develop a system of more local governance that really delivers what the central state wants.
So that raises an interesting question, which I know you've written about, which is the devolving of power within England really devolving, or is it simply delegating to localised authorities what Westminster wants?
If you think about the different arguments that there have been since devolution was introduced more widely, the different arguments about what should be developed in England, and ever since the millennium, there has been a focus on, is it possible to build a sort of middle layer of governance that will sit between local councils and the central state? And often that focus has really been on, well, let's devise authorities that will enable the sort of things that central government wants to do to be done more effectively. And there's been a to and fro between the different political parties about what's the best model, what's the best way of building out that layer, and no clear consensus really has emerged between them. I think one of the very striking aspects of this system is that if you look at the sort of language that's used to justify that kind of development. It's often really a language about economic development. I mean, that's been really what's driven the push towards trying to decentralise in England. And it's not really been, as has happened elsewhere, a focus upon giving people in those areas the tools to make real decisions that might actually meaningfully affect the regions or the cities where they live. So that, it seems to me, is much more about the centre sort of cascading some powers down in a very controlled way, not really giving whole regions, or in the current model, giving city regions, not really giving them the tools to make decisions that might, for instance, diverge from or go against what central government wants. So I think there is a question mark there about whether that's, in any meaningful sense, devolution.
So is it, in a sense, does this so-called devolution simply reinforce control from the centre by requiring devolved assemblies and devolved mayors to implement policy that is decided at Westminster?
I mean, one way in which the centre has kept pretty tight control has been to develop this model through bilateral negotiations with different local authorities, which it invited to come together to consider whether they wanted to move towards having some kind of combined authority with an elected mayor on top. Now, that sort of bilateral negotiation model has really helped, I think, Whitehall keep a fairly firm grip on both on the powers that are passed down, but on the way in which those will be interpreted. But at the same time, of course, when you do create these new tiers of government, when you create new governing authorities, of course, there is always the risk that, particularly if you have elected politicians heading them, that actually those leaders will turn around and say, actually, we want to have more powers, or we want to use our powers to do something different to what you, central government, want to do. And I think in the context of COVID-19, I think the way in which a figure like Andy Burnham, or the mayor of the Liverpool City region, the way in which those figures were able to use the sort of soft power that they have as people who've been directly elected by the area that they represent against central government, and say, look, we think we know as well as you, if not better, what our region needs. I think that was a very important moment, and does illustrate that even though these are quite constrained authorities in what they can do, the potential for them to develop in ways that might sort of run against central authority is quite considerable.
An important moment reinforced perhaps by the fact that Andy Burnham seemed to garner support not just from Labour partisans, but also from local Conservatives, quite prominent local Conservatives. And I got the sense that Conservatives in the north of England were learning a lesson that was learned by Conservatives a generation ago in Scotland, which is that you've got to find a way of riding two horses at the same time. One, loyalty to the Conservative government in London, but at the same time, a keen eye on public opinion at home. Do you think that's significant?
I think there is something in that. What we can see in that recent crisis is a dynamic emerging where political figures who are representing some of these areas begin to sense that they need to be seen to be standing up for that region, and particularly in some ways standing against the central government, even if in the case of Conservative MPs, they of course support that government. So I think that was a very telling moment, which revealed that dynamic is there if you create a more devolved system. I think the other aspect of that, though, that's important is that one of the hopes, really, of people who have called for directly elected mayors was that these figures might be able to represent people across party lines, as well as just presenting themselves as party figures. Now, I mean, actually, we haven't had that much of that, I think, with the current system, because most of the elected mayors we've got, most of the metro mayors are actually from the two main parties. But I think you did see in that particular episode someone like Burnham being able to use his ability to reach across party lines and to try to mobilise opinion in different parts of the political world. And I think that, again, might well point to the way in which these mayors may develop as political figures, as figures who, because they're outside Westminster, are able at times to be a bit less tribal and a bit more broadly based in the way in which they develop their political appeal.
What we learned in the end was that the centre still holds most of the cards. That was very publicly obvious. Do you think it has had any effect on public opinion within England, and especially in the north of England, to the nature of centralised power in England, and perhaps has increased support for further devolution, entrenching of the powers that already exist?
I think at the time, there was some polling that was done at the time of that particular crisis, and Andy Burnham's stance looked as if it was popular with a majority of people, although at the same time there was also a debate in Greater Manchester about the potential health risks of the stance he was taking. So there were conflicting currents there. But I think standing back from it, it's hard to be certain about what's the kind of longer term effect. What will this really shift opinion in terms of the way in which people feel about this devolution model? I think one thing we do know is that actually not that many people before that episode were particularly aware of the existence of all the powers that devolved mayors had. It's a model that's been in play for a few years. In some cases, like in the case of Andy Burnham, he's a fairly high-profile political figure. So in Manchester, the awareness of him is fairly high compared to mayors elsewhere. But I think one thing that may have happened is that more people may have become aware of the reality of the existence of these mayors. Now, whether that translates into a positive demand for more powers be passed to these mayors, or for them, to be able to have, say, for instance, powers over taxation or areas that devolution has not extended into, I think it's not as yet clear. And one of the things that we do know about public opinion in England is that most people, most of the time, look to the political centre and assume that is where power lies, and that's where accountability is held. And I think that culture of sort of centralism runs quite deep, I think, in England.
So I was going to ask you just answered it already, but I was going to make the point that in the 1980s and 90s, during those 18 years of rule by Margaret Thatcher and John Major, what happened here in Scotland, where I'm talking to you from, was a growing sense that Westminster rule was losing its legitimacy in Scotland, and to some extent in Wales as well. And that led to the creation of the Scottish Parliament in 1999 after a referendum in 1997. So you don't think something similar is happening in the north of England about with people at a popular level questioning the legitimacy of Westminster?
I think what has been happening, and I think actually this predates COVID, goes back a number of years, is that I think in a large number of places in England, particularly outside the biggest, outside the cores of the biggest cities, I think you have seen the growth of a pretty jaundiced attitude towards government in London. And I think there is perhaps a parallel there with the way in which sentiment has developed over time in other parts of the UK. And I think the roots of that are quite deep. I mean, there's as you well know, there's long been a tension between different parts of provincial England, to use that term, and London. But I think from the mid-2000s on, I think that does intensify. And I think you can see a relationship between deepening regional inequality and particularly the gap, the really big gap that opens up after the financial and banking crisis between the way in which London and the South East recover and then the very different economic performance in other parts of England. And I think that gap in regional economies is an important source of quite considerable growing discontent. Now, I think there are other issues as well. I think perceived differences over issues like immigration. Some, I think, grumbles about devolution elsewhere and the powers that are seen as being given to Scotland in particular. I think there's a medley of issues. And of course, the European question becomes a source of some discontent too. But I think that the difference is that still the case is most people want a change of approach at the centre. Now, I think the interesting question after COVID will be whether some of that discontent does get channeled by figures like Burnham towards a feeling that, hold on, we actually need our own sort of more local administration. I mean, it's hard to see devolution as a popular cause in English opinion at the moment, but I wouldn't rule out the possibility that as figures like Burnham they will be making these kind of arguments more loudly. And if they are able to deliver on some of their mandates, we may see opinion beginning to move behind that kind of model in some parts of the country.
Put it into historical context for me. When you look at the great civic architecture of the Victorian age, what you see in that architecture in Glasgow, in Liverpool, in Manchester, in Birmingham, is an expression of civic pride in a place of great civic identity. And you get the impression that people in those town halls and city chambers wielded real power. They were oligarchical in nature, I suppose, but nonetheless, these do seem to be genuine regional power bases. How was that lost? How was it that power ended up so centralised at Whitehall and Westminster?
Well, it's a complicated story, and it's one that unfolds across the last century, across the 20th century. I mean, it is undoubtedly true that in the Victorian era, in particular, you did have local political figures, the leaders of municipal authorities, who, by dint of their success in being reforming, popular local leaders, were also national figures. They developed a national profile and reputation. And Joseph Chamberlain in Birmingham, I guess, would be the paradigm example of that. But over the course of the 20th century, I mean, there are a number of different factors in play here, but two that I would stress would be warfare and welfare. So the impact of two world wars and the significant growth of state functions and capacity at the centre, as well as the development in different stages of a statewide welfare system, which did involve Whitehall taking responsibility for different elements of health and welfare provision that had previously been delivered locally. I mean, those, I think, had very centralising effects. And then in the second half of the last century, you see a very consistent focus in British politics on the idea of developing service provision, public services they're developed, and then being delivered more equally, more consistently across the country. And I think the combination of those different forces are very much central to that change in the seesaw of power between central and local government. And I mean, it plays out most importantly, I think, in terms of finance over local government funding, where you see a very significant fall in proportion of local government funding that's raised locally up until really the late 19th century into the early 20th century. And because the centre holds that very significant lever, it is able to then force local government to restructure, to change the way it operates, and to turn it, I think, slowly over time into something like a delivery agency, really, for the priorities established at the centre.
And in terms of finance, as you say, in terms of money raised and disposed in the country, is it true that the UK and in England in particular is probably the most centralised state in Europe?
Yes, there's some debate amongst academics about who that particular prize or whatever should be awarded to. I mean, certainly it depends which powers you use to measure centralisation. But if you put the financial situation together with other metrics, then I think England is up there as certainly one of the three most centralised countries in terms of its governance in Europe. And of course, there's another element to this that is so important, because England itself is not only governed in a very centralised way, but it does not have its own institutions. These are British institutions. They're the institutions of the British state. And it's long been assumed that the English are happy to be governed in that kind of way. Now, I think one of the really interesting questions that opens up, not just because of COVID, but perhaps also because of Brexit, is whether that remains the case, whether the English still are happy to consent to that kind of model of being governed by the British state and its core institutions.
But it has moved to some extent in the direction of an English parliament, in the sense that we have English votes for English laws. The SNP, which now sit for the vast majority of seats in Scotland, don't vote for the most part on legislation that affects only England and Wales. So it is the UK House of Commons is, in some sense, morphing into what looks like an English parliament when it's debating matters that are England and Wales only.
I mean, it's true that English votes for English laws is an important change in the rules in relation to bills or bits of bills, clauses and bills that affect England only. I'm not so sure that that represents a dynamic or a direction of travel. I mean, I think if you look carefully at that system, which is very complicated, is frankly not understood by many MPs and certainly not very visible to many people outside the House of Commons. I think it looks more like an artful attempt to introduce something which does change the rules. It does mean that there wouldn't be the kind of egregious examples of, as we had in the second Blair government over something like tuition fees, of a piece of legislation passing that only really applied to England and passing it to a considerable degree because Scottish MPs were whipped to vote for it. I think that kind of instance has been ruled out. But the rules really are complicated. They're pretty Byzantine. And I don't think many people to whom they apply, i.e. MPs when they vote, feel that this is given them a voice as English representatives. There's no sense in which there's a clearer, I think, voice and representative element for England that's come out of that system. Now, the one caveat to that, of course, is that, were there to be a government elected which did not carry a majority of the support of a majority of English MPs, then that system of English votes for English laws would really matter. But we have not been in that position since this change was made.
Well, let me ask you about what has happened to English national identity in the age of devolution in the last 20 years or so. I mean, my own strong experience as a Scotsman living in London for close to 30 years is that many English people, even quite engaged English people, struggled to identify the difference in England and Britain and use the two terms as though they were interchangeable. And so back then, it didn't really matter that England was governed by British institutions because most English people didn't really think about the difference very carefully or very closely. Do you think that's changed? And is there a new sense of English national identity that perhaps wasn't there or was somehow confused or even fused with British national identity in the last 20 years or so?
I think there has been change. I think it's still the case that the expression of English national identity often does take that sort of blurred, quite confusing form. So it's entirely the case that many English people do still use those terms, English and British, interchangeably. But I think actually it's also striking that the symbols of English national identity, I mean, particularly the cross of St. George and the flag of St. George, has become much more present in English culture. I think there's a lot of evidence, both some polling evidence, but also I think other kinds of research, qualitative research, people sort of listening very carefully to how people talk about their identity. That sort of evidence does show that in different parts of the country, people seem to hang more on the idea of being English, I think, now than was the case 15, 20 years ago. I think there's a very interesting question about when that began to change and what's caused it. And I mean, you'll be aware that the term English nationalism is bandied around a lot at the moment, particularly since Brexit. My sense is that that rather simplifies a more complicated set of changes. I think there are some people for whom English identity has become a kind of a way of expressing discontent and some kinds of grievance. And that sort of more, I think that does fit a nationalist model. I think, though, there are many more people who have, if you like, more quietly given a greater accent to their sense of an English identity. It's come to matter a bit more to them. And that may be to do with the European question. It may also be to do with devolution and the sort of awareness of the differences in different parts of the country. And then I think there has been something else which sort of is slightly different again, which is a sort of cultural renaissance of feel for English tradition. And you see that in things like folk festivals and English ale and so on. And some of that I think is very cultural, doesn't have a particularly strong political dimension. That's been floating around for 15, 20 years as well. So I think we've seen these different currents beginning to come together. And I think that the political crises of our age, Brexit and now COVID, have brought them to the surface a bit more and made them perhaps more politically resonant.
What do you think has happened to public opinion in England about England's position within the Union in the age of devolution to Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland? Do English people care about the Union?
I think if you go back to devolution when it was introduced, I mean, it is undoubtedly the case that there was very little awareness of that, interest in devolution elsewhere, and primarily because the politicians who introduced it did not see it as a topic that they felt the English particularly wanted to hear about. So there was a sort of very notable lack of engagement, I think, in England about devolution itself. I don't think that necessarily means the English don't care about the Union. I think English opinion has been quite reactive to certain issues. So you can see that when the West Lothian question was raised in those votes I mentioned, and also on questions like territorial spending, does Scotland get more government funding than it deserves than, say, the northeast of England? You see those issues do, in quite a reactive way, I think, spark an interest. But I also think that the Scottish referendum of 2014, I think that was an important moment in waking many English people up to changes in the Union and, of course, to the shifts in attitude in Scotland. So, I mean, it seems to me that in many ways what's happening is that the English, far from sort of shifting wholesale to be nationalists, in some ways the English are waking up to the complex realities of the Union in which they are the dominant player. And I mean, what that's going to mean on concrete issues, how the English will feel about, say, if there's another Scottish referendum, or how they might feel about a border poll in Northern Ireland, that's hard to read. I think if you look back over opinion polling over the last 20 years, I think you can see a trend that Northern Ireland matters less to English people over that period. I think this question of Scotland would instigate much stronger reactions in England. And in both ways, I think there are some people who'd be happy for the Scots to leave. I think a majority of English people would actually prefer the Union to continue broadly on the footing it's on, even if there were changes in the balance within it.
There's something very telling. We're going to wrap up in a second, but if you wanted to buy a book, for example, on the Act of Union of 1707, you had to look in Scottish history for it, not British history, even though this is the founding document of the state of which we are all citizens. A strong impression is that English public opinion regarded the Union as something for the Scots to worry about and not for them. And even when Alex Salmond won his majority in 2011 and it became inevitable that there was going to be a referendum on the future existence of the United Kingdom, most of my friends in journalism in London thought that was a matter for the Scots and didn't really affect them. But my strong impression is that 2020 has been a game changer in this, because devolved powers have never been more visibly exercised than they are now. It has changed the way many people in England think about the way their country is governed, because it is now highly visibly a union of 4 self-governing nations, albeit a lopsided one, in a way that it hasn't been before.
I think COVID could well become a watershed moment. I mean, it's always hard to tell, but I think we may well look back on it as a really important moment in the history of English feelings about the devolved union. I mean, undoubtedly, I think the sort of revelation to many people that on a lot of key issues, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, Northern is in fact the Prime Minister of England. I think that will have come as a shock to many people. And conversely, the realization that, say, the Welsh government can make key decisions about many of the issues that relate to the public health of its population, and that, of course, then have an impact upon people who live in the borderlands, the other side of the border. I think that may well be an important moment too. I think you've got to see COVID, though, also in the context of other developments and prior crises. I do think that Brexit has also contributed to the sense that actually this is a four-part union that is moving politically in quite different directions. And I think prior to that, the Scottish referendum woke up parts of English opinion to the very important changes that had happened to the UK and to the very different attitudes towards it, the other side of the border. So I think this is now a more dynamic situation. I think we should remember, though, that what has not happened in England that has happened in Scotland and in a different way in Wales and, of course, Northern Ireland, is there has not been a meaningful debate about devolution, about how the state is organised, about where power should lie. That kind of sense of a debate that connects with a wider society and that involves not just politicians, but goes more widely to the people, that hasn't really happened. So English opinion on some of these issues, I would argue, is really quite weakly formed. And I think one of the things to watch out for in the coming years is to see how English opinion hardens around certain issues. For instance, around the question of the union in the context of a potential further Scottish independence referendum.
And with that look ahead, we'll leave it. You've been listening to Constitutionally Sound from the Centre on Constitutional Change at the University of Edinburgh. Look out for a forthcoming CCC event on December the 10th called COVID-19 and the Future of Devolution in England. And if you're listening to this after December the 10th, you can find a recording on the Centre's YouTube channel. Thanks again to Michael Kenny, Professor of Public Policy at the University of Cambridge. Join us again next time. Thank you.